In this video, I'm going to do a review of practice exam question number 5, and I will also give you some tips on how to make an IRAC checklist and then how to use it in the exam. All right, so the outline of the answer for the practice exam question number 5 involving Dom defendant and his girlfriend Verna victim is as follows. The first issue that you should discuss is hearsay. Note that the only part of neighbor's testimony that is problematic is her description of victim's statement. So that is all you need to discuss here. Victim's statement is obviously relevant, so you don't need to address the relevance issue. Instead, you should go straight to hearsay, which is the key issue in court and would be the objection that the attorney would make. Okay, so you'd start with hearsay. You'll need to state the rule, apply the rule to the facts, and conclude. Then you need to look for an exception. There are two possibilities here. One is present sense impressions, and the other is excited utterances. It doesn't matter which order you do the exceptions in, but you should do both. All right, let's look at the first issue a little bit more carefully. In your exam answer, you need to identify hearsay as an issue, state the rule, and you can use the basic rule that we used in class. Hearsay is an out-of-court statement offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted. You then need to apply that rule to the facts. Okay, note that you need to use the facts in your analysis, and you have to not only use the fact that matters, but also you need to explain how it matters. So here on the slide, I've put the fact in blue and how the fact matters in red. Okay, so in your exam answer, I would expect to see both. Your explanation that victim asserted that defendant shoved her, which is a statement. She said it out of court because she was at home, and it's being offered for its truth that Dom defendant did shove her. Okay, so this is pretty obviously hearsay. I think you can do it quite efficiently as I did here on the slide, but you need to cover each aspect. Give me the rule, apply it to the facts, and then a quick conclusion. All right, our second issue is whether the present sense impressions exception to the hearsay rule applies. Okay, so again, you would need to state the rule. You do not need to state it verbatim from the rule book. You can use the requirements as listed on my slide as long as you give me an accurate description of the rule. Then you need to apply the rule to the facts. So for each requirement, you need to give me facts that show how it is or is not met. Okay, so for the first requirement, the statement must describe an event. The fact is that that the defendant shoved her against the wall, and then you need to tie that into the law, as you can see I've done in red. For requirement number 2, the statement must be made immediately after the event. You need to look at the arguments for both sides. Okay, so the prosecution will argue that neighbor went right over after victim rushed out of the house, and victim said that defendant had just shoved her, showing that the immediacy requirement is met. Again, make that tie back into the rule. Ask yourself whether there are any facts supporting the other side, and here there are. I think that the defendant has a good argument that the timing is too late because neighbor had time to dry her hands, put on her coat, walk over, and the word just is often vague. Okay, so again, we're looking here for whether the person had time to make up a lie. That's the rationale, and it also helps us apply this. So that's a good place to use it. Okay, and then I'd be looking for you to make a conclusion after arguing both sides with an explanation of why you think that one side should win or the other. Okay, and then you can move on to excited utterances. Again, state the rule, then apply the rule to the facts. Here, our first requirement is a startling event. You need to give the fact. This was an assault, which is a startling event. Requirement number 2 is that the statement related to the event. You need to state that requirement and explain how it's met. Her description was about how defendant had assaulted her by shoving her against the wall, which relates to the event. And then you need to consider whether the declarant spoke while under the stress of excitement. Okay, there are facts going both ways on that issue, which I'm going to put on the next slide. Where there are facts going both ways, you should be sure to make the arguments for both sides. All right, so the prosecutor here has a number of facts which help the prosecutor. Note as I go through these facts that I'm using the factors that we discussed with regard to excited utterances in class. Okay, so one fact is that the victim was sobbing, so was very upset. She said it had just happened, so there was not much time for her stress to have worn off. She herself was personally involved, not just an onlooker, so it would be more stressful and the stress would last longer. Being assaulted would be extremely frightening, so the stress would be high and would last. On the other hand, the defendant will argue that some minutes had passed since the event, so there was time for the stress to wear off. She was not hysterical. The facts say she was just crying, so the stress was not too severe. She also made the statement in response to neighbors' inquiry. She didn't just blurt it out, so she had the ability to think, reflect, and make up a lie. Okay, you should then give me your conclusion on how the court should rule with your explanation of why the court should go one way or the other. Particularly with this exception, it's useful to use the rationale. So notice that in this exam question, there were facts helpful to both parties on the timing issue for present sense impressions and the stress of excitement issue for excited utterances. Where there are good arguments on both sides, so it's a close call, I'll give you full credit regardless of which result you reach, as long as you have made the arguments on both sides and explained why the judge should rule one way rather than the other. All right, so a quick guide to grading. I typically give 1 point for spotting the issue, 1 or 2 points for stating the rule correctly, and then a point for every relevant fact used. To get the points for using facts, you have to both describe the fact and explain how it matters. For conclusions, I typically only give 1 point, and I only give points if there were facts cutting both ways, you made the arguments on both sides, and you gave a plausible reason for your choice. Okay, I'd also like to suggest a study tip, which is to make IRAC outlines. This will help you bridge the gap from making a big outline, which contains a lot of detail about the rules, to actually being prepared to write out an exam answer in IRAC form. All right, so to make an IRAC outline or an IRAC checklist, what you want to do is take each rule and set it up in IRAC form, thinking through how you would go about writing an exam answer on that particular rule. In evidence, issue spotting is absolutely critical, and it's often quite difficult to do because we've covered so many rules in the course. So start each checklist with an issue spotting tip. How do you create an issue spotting tip? Think through what it is that will bring that rule into play. In other words, visualize what type of facts need to be in the question in order for that question to raise this issue, and then write those down. Okay, the rest of the checklist is set up in standard IRAC form. State the issue. You don't need to say anything more than that in your checklist. State the rule. Here you should include an accurate statement of the rule in the form you're going to memorize it. In other words, figure out what your rule statement will be for this rule and write it out that way. Then you won't have to waste time in the exam figuring that out. Then take the rule and split it out into its individual requirements for your application section. Under each requirement, describe for yourself what it is that you will need to write about this requirement on the exam. I typically start my little descriptions with use facts to explain, and then I give myself a tip. So we're not trying to include all the detail from your big outline here, just a brief tip for yourself on what it is that you have to do to show that this requirement is or is not met. Okay. Here's an example of an IRAC checklist that I made for present sense impressions. My issue spotting tip was to look for a statement describing something as it happens or right after. Okay, then I have state the issue, state the rule. Here I went back to my slide where I had broken the rule down into its individual requirements. I think that a list of requirements is easier to memorize than a paragraph. So I find this helpful. You can either use the rule itself or my list. Either one will be fine. Okay, so I've written out the rule, and then in my application section, notice that I'm going to take the first requirement here and I'll drop it down here. The statement must describe the event. Then I tell myself what it is I have to do on the exam with that requirement. Okay, so I wrote use the facts to explain how the statement described an event, and I reminded myself that no analysis is allowed. Okay, the second requirement, which I've pulled from here down to here, is that the statement must be made immediately after the event, during or immediately after the event. I know there's an outside limit of 2 minutes. Okay, so what am I going to do with the facts here? I'm going to use the facts to show what the time lapse was between the statement and the event. I'm going to anticipate that if there's a problem, it's probably going to be here, so I'll remind myself to argue both sides if close. Finally, we have the conclusion. Here, I'm reminding myself to use the rationale, which is no time to make up a lie, because that's very helpful in applying this particular hearsay exception. All right, then, how will I use this in the exam? In the exam, you have to read the question, spot the issue, set up the structure of your answer. Here's where you're going to use it. So we've got the 5 tasks, these 3, plus you've got to fill in the facts and write out your answer. So after reading the question and spotting the issue, then I'm going to set up the structure of my answer. And what I do in the exam on my scratch paper is I just shorthand my IRAC outline. Notice I'm not writing in all the detail, but I'm giving myself enough to remind myself that my first paragraph will be about the issue, my second paragraph will be stating the rule, and then I will go into analysis. I'll have a separate paragraph for each requirement. Notice also that I've stretched this out so I have room to fill in facts. Underneath each requirement, I've put a P and a D. You could also put for and against. This reminds me to look for facts for each party in case there are facts cutting both ways. Okay, my next step is going to be to fill in the facts, which I'm going to do on my scratch paper before I start writing my answer. Okay, and here they are. So again, I've just pulled this down and I've put in my facts here. For the event, there were facts only going one way, so I just put an X in for the defendant. This was clearly a description of an event. There's no argument going the other way. I won't waste any time on it. Okay, and then you can see the facts as I filled them in on the remainder. Okay, and then write out the answer. And I think at this point you're in much better shape to do that effectively. Okay, that's the end of the show. Please let me know if you have any questions.